Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Questioning Behavior, and today we are once more questioning the application of behavioral science in public policy.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy.
Now, don't think this is going to be the exact same episode as we've done with Ghana. Today we have got a different speaker who has his own views about public policy and who has actually had quite a long list of work experience in it. But before we introduce him, and I have a feeling you might know who it is, I mean, you probably have been able to read the title. Sarah, so since the episode that we've done with Ghana, have you given behavioral science and public policy some more thought?
Oh, for sure. I mean, if the listener hasn't already taken the time to listen to the episode, I really recommend it. Ghana's got so much to say about this topic, and she says it's so much better than both of us combined, which is why we brought her on the show. But I think it's always something that's whirring away in the back of my mind a little bit about the sort of the clout that behavioral science has in public policy. We're living in a time where lots of people are aware of behavioral science, and probably more than were aware of it 10, 15 years ago. Not everyone, obviously. We are within the bubble itself. So for us, it's a big part of our world. So maybe that's inflating it a little bit in my mind. But I'm always very skeptical. I always come at it with a bit of a healthy dose of skepticism. And to be honest, I've been doing my absolute best to stay away from the news, because having those daily briefings in the UK, it can just be so draining to having to think about it all the time. I don't know about you, Merle. How have you been feeling about public policy and the current crisis and all of the stuff that's going on right now?
Well, I mean, what we know, let's keep it UK focused, although I am not British, nor am I currently in the UK, but for the sake of the argument, we'll focus on the UK. Sure. I remember the predominant argument for the choices that they made being behavioral fatigue, which we still really don't know what that was based on, which is becoming increasingly more problematic. But I can get that no one is gonna step forward, given the shite that the concept has gotten. Like, I can understand that reasoning. But the main joke, if you can even speak of a joke in these times, is just that how they've gone about it, and then the daily briefings, and then the mass information overload, where every single time you get a press conference or some type of statement where effectively nothing has happened. That is exactly what behavioral fatigue is about. I am tired of your daily statements with absolutely no new content. Like, that to me is a joke, almost.
I mean, we should probably explain to the listener a little bit more about the behavioral fatigue fiasco. I don't know if you can call it that. That sort of happened, was it a couple of months ago? So the UK government came out. March, right? In March, yeah. So the official lockdown in the UK was announced on the 23rd of March. But before then, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the government should be imposing lockdown. Should they be following the example of other countries, such as Italy? I think that was the one that was largely talked about at the time. And there was all this discussion about why we should be locking down now, or why we should be trying to delay lockdown. I think one of the arguments that was used was this idea of behavioral fatigue. So if we were to lock down now, then people would get fatigued from having to keep doing the same behavior over and over again, and they would stop adhering to the sort of the socially distant behaviors that would be enforced. And I think that was like a very big, this is what like sign of behavioral science, sort of like, the behavioral scientists have told us that behavioral fatigue is a big problem, and so we have no choice but to delay lockdown. And that rubbed a lot of behavioral scientists up the wrong way, as we will hear very shortly.
Yeah, I feel like that is a really good introduction of just jumping into the interview, because the person that we're interviewing is one of the key people in orchestrating the open letter to the government, which indicated that, first of all, behavioral fatigue not that well known, not that applied, and especially the idea of behavioral scientists say. If you then produce an open letter that has been signed by 600 to 700 behavioral scientists claiming that they didn't say this, and they are not backing it either from an academic perspective or an integrity perspective even, it ruffled a lot of feathers, and I think that's a very good introduction for our next guest. So let's dive into it. Okay, and today we are actually talking to Nick Chater. Nick, please do introduce yourself. Who are you?
Hi, yes. So, Merle, I'm a professor of behavioural science at Warwick Business School, and I'm interested in a number of sort of general questions about how the mind works. So I'm particularly interested in general principles rather than sort of specific details. But I am also interested in general principles as they apply to the real world. So in fact, I think general principles are kind of crucial if you're going to apply things to the real world, because we've never done the exact experiment that's going to carry over to the situation you're in. But if we know some general things, we might be able to carry them over. So I've done some work with in setting up a company called Decision Technology with my friend Henry Stott. So that works on applied problems with regulators and businesses. And was early involved in the behavioural insights team, not these days, but in the days when it was in the cabinet office and soon after. And these days I'm involved in I'm a member of the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK body that oversees the reduction in climate greenhouse gases down to net zero on our current targets by 2050.
All right. That's an entire CV if I've ever heard one. Well, it should be pretty clear where your interests lie. So then the second almost standard question is, how did you actually get into behavioral science?
Yeah, so I started off as a fairly pure cognitive scientist. So cognitive science is the closely related project to behavioral science, but it's really focusing on trying to understand the mind as a computational system. And so you're focusing primarily on the computational processes within an individual person, and it's not quite so true these days. But at least in the I guess it was the late 80s, early 90s, when I was starting, so I did my PhD in late 80s. We didn't think much about interactions between people. I mean, that was a fairly marginal question. You just thought about individual minds, get them sorted out, and then we can worry about how people interact later. Now, of course, these days we might think slightly differently. But so that was my starting point. Then off into thinking about broader questions about how this has impacts on collections of people and indeed also policy.
So you've had a fairly linearly academic pathway into behavioral science, but
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but I guess you've also had lots of experience interacting with businesses and people who are not within the academic world. So how did you come to be advising the UK government or setting up your own consultancy?
Well, yes, I mean I've always been interested in applied problems, but never really had any idea what I might contribute to them. So I'm not sure how much that's actually changed, but anyhow, the world seems to have decided that it's worth having a chat with me about some of these questions, and that's brilliant. So that's great delight for me, because I've always, just as a human being, been very interested in how to run government and businesses better. So in the case of starting Decision Technology, one of my PhD students, Henry Stott, who I mentioned earlier, he had worked as a consultant for the director of a large consultancy, Oliver Wyman. And he and I, so he was a PhD student of mine for whatever it was, 4 years. And during that time, we thought, well, actually, there's some pretty interesting things we can do together, because both of us had the idea that if we understood the way people make decisions better, that would clearly be potentially very helpful to helping businesses and governments interact with people. Now, in fact, I think working with Henry was, in fact, probably the thing that pushed me into thinking about the judgment and decision-making in behavioral economics world. Before that, I primarily looked at language, reasoning, lots of other things like categorization, perception, things that I'm still very interested in, but I hadn't really thought much about decision-making. And I had this sort of vague idea of Kahneman and Tversky and I knew about expected utility theory, and that was sort of as far as it went. So that was in a way, the need to think about practical problems actually changed my focus of interest quite a lot.
Fantastic.
All right.
I mean, I guess we should talk about the elephant in the room, which is coronavirus and the current epidemic we are currently living through right now. I mean, you said that you were sort of a consultant in the early phases of setting up the BIT, but I mean, very recently you have gained some attention from an open letter you wrote to the government, particularly about the use of behavioural science and behavioural insights to influence policy. Could you tell us a little bit more about this open letter, where it came from, and how you delivered it?
Yes, and I should say that the open letter was, the idea for that was came from Ulrike Hahn at Birkbeck, and she and I and others drafted a letter, and then it was signed by, I think, about 600 or maybe now 700 behavioural scientists. So
Sarah and I have to indicate we signed it as well. We're with you, Nick.
There are conflicts of interest there. Fantastic. So where did that come from? So early on in the pandemic, the government spokespeople started to say, rather mystifyingly, that we shouldn't lock down too soon, because if we did, we would people would not be able to continue in lockdown because of the problem of, quotes, behavioural fatigue. And I think there are two problems with this idea. But the first one is a behavioural science problem. The other is more of a general reasoning error, I think, or misunderstanding of how pandemics work or something. So the one that we wanted to pick up was that the idea that there's a sort of general concept of behavioural fatigue, irrespective of what the task is, what you're trying to do, and we can say, oh yes, whatever it is, you're going to get pretty tired of it after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it may be. So we mustn't start too soon. I think that's just a fundamental mistake. And clearly there are some things we get fed up with. There's no doubt about that. But on the other hand, there are some things we do our entire lives. I mean, you wouldn't say you don't start brushing your teeth too soon as a child, because, I mean, you're just never going to keep it up. That would be a ridiculous thing to do. In fact, with many things, the sooner you start, the more you establish the habit, the easier it gets. Now, clearly, I don't imagine for a second that if we didn't had lockdown for sort of like 2 years or something, that would be absolutely diabolical. But one of the reasons it would be terrible for us is that is we just economically we would be in desperate straits. I mean, it's clearly not feasible for practical reasons. But we have no theoretical idea about what the end point for lockdown is. And I think if there's strong enough reasons, people will go to all sorts of extraordinary extremes. I mean, so I think there's sort of a fundamental idea that behavioural scientists have told the government X that behavioural fatigue is a problem, seemed wrong to us. So we put the letter together, got lots of behavioural scientists to sign it, and that, I think, So I think the thing that we wanted to pick up in the letter was to counter the idea that behavioural science as a discipline has a message for the government, which is don't start this too soon because behavioural fatigue will be a problem. And I don't think this is something that behavioural scientists think, and I don't think probably the idea of behavioural fatigue came from behavioural scientists inside government. There's no indication that that's the case, but it's a bit of a mystery where the phrase came from, but it's got no obvious basis in any of the advice that we're given as far as I'm aware. But the other thing that's the more sort of fundamental problem, which really we didn't write about, but it seems really very obvious really, is that if you're going to lock down at all, the longer you wait, the longer you're going to have to lock down for. So this is on the basic principle that if you're trying to put your fire out, you're going to it's going to take you longer to put it out if you leave it to burn. And that is just such an obvious thing that nobody could really deny. That it's very mysterious that this wasn't picked up. And in fact, I think the reason it was even in the rhetoric of the government at all was that we were still in a kind of a world where we weren't quite clear if we were trying to suppress the virus or whether we were just trying to let it run through the population slowly. So I think because of that confusion, I mean, if you want to do that, if you want to let the virus run slowly through the population, then you might not want to start too soon because you might actually want to get the virus at a reasonable level, and then over a very long period, it just trundles through the population. And that's the idea if you think you can really control it. But it doesn't make any sense if you're trying to, as it were, put out the fire.
All right.
And it's a really interesting case study because you're not sure whether it's just an extreme case of myopia or is there some sort of conspiracy theory going on. Maybe we'll find out in a couple of years, the cabinet notes that were passed between key players. But something that I've heard a lot in terms of the UK government's response is that they're following the science. And everything that they do has to be based in science and grounded in science. They're not going to give recommendations about wearing masks until they get the science that it's the right thing to do. So is behavioural science being used as a scapegoat here? I mean...
No, I think there's quite a lot of behavioural science behind the... I don't know the details of this, but I imagine there's a great deal of behavioural science behind the testing of specific slogans and messages and so on, and that's probably very sensible. So there's a kind of methodological element of behavioural science, and there's a kind of things we know, and there are very many things we do know, frankly. So going back to my original point about principles, what we really want are principles. We can say, well, people work like this, therefore, in this situation, they're probably going to do such and such. And we know a few things, but not very many. So what, in practice, you always need to do is to test things. And I think probably the government will be doing a lot of testing, and that's very sensible. But yeah, I don't think the claim to be following the science is in some sense it's sensible. Of course, you wouldn't want people not to be following the science, but the science doesn't really give you a policy. And so I think the particular way in which governments, and I don't particularly single out the UK government here, although it may be an example, what governments I think and decision makers of all kinds tend to do is they tend to think, well, I want to know how the world is, so that perhaps the science can help me know that. Other things can help me know that. So I've got to think, what am I dealing with here? Is this the flu? Is this a bit like SARS? Is it is it something that's going to fizzle out in the summer? I just want to have an understanding of what I'm dealing with, and the science may help me with that. And then when I've got that, I will do, as it were, the best response to that model of the world. So I think I want to know how the world is, and then given I know how it is, I develop my policy. And that is quite often a disastrous strategy. It's very natural. It's the way we naturally operate, but it's often a disastrous strategy because what you don't do then is you don't plan through what will happen if your model is wrong. So you don't really know what's going to happen with the virus, and the virus might develop in a different range of different ways. So what you really want to have are policies that are robust to different possibilities. And I think this is something that Phil Johnson-Laird, the originator of mental models, talks about. In fact, I remember a talk of his where he very memorably said, this is probably the fundamental reasoning error of all reasoning errors. And I think there's something deeply right about this, that we tend to assume that there's one way the world can be. And it's very effortful for us to think, well, I suppose it might not be like that. Maybe it's like something else. And our natural decision-making strategy is to think, let me think of my best model of the world and make my decisions on that basis. So, for example, if you think, well, the masks, we're not quite sure if they're useful, you might think, well, the downside is quite small. I mean, wearing masks, if they're not very effective, people are doing it all over the world, and then it's not a big problem. But if they are effective, well, they're a very cheap way of controlling this virus. That would be a really bad idea not to at least prepare yourself for a massive campaign and get lots and lots of masks in place and so on and so on. Or similarly thinking of something like preparations for a possible pandemic when it was not clear that the pandemic would spread in the way it did. Even when you had the virus arising in Wuhan in China, you'd think that European countries and the States would be thinking, yes, we must start building a test for this very, very fast on a massive scale. We must start buying PPE. We must generally start to prepare ourselves because suppose there's a 10% chance there's going to be a giant pandemic. Well, we're going to be well worth it. But of course, the natural instinct is to think, do I think this is going to be a problem? No, I think it's going to be fine. Or we'll just keep going. And to think, well, the science is, in fact, you might even say the science is telling me at this point. I'm not sure what the science was saying at that stage, but the science might even be telling you, probably it's going to be fine.
How optimistic.
But that's not how optimistic, yeah. But the answer has got to be, but take the precautions anyway.
So ideally, what would have happened from a policy perspective, from a behavioral scientific perspective?
Yeah, I think the thing that we need to be doing much better is to have much more. Well, first of all, we do need to have much more open and transparent policy formation processes. So I think what we really want to have is a situation where the government can openly debate with relevant experts what they think the likelihood of a pandemic arising of some particular strain being dangerous is. And that wants to be as transparent as possible, because then other people can say, well, hang on, you're not considering this or whatever. But crucially, this will generate a range of possibilities, and the policymaking process, which itself, I think, the more open it is, the better, needs to be as reflective as possible about of all those possibilities. Not all the, there may be some crazy fringe possibilities we don't have to worry about. We don't have to worry about the danger that it's caused by 5G or something mad like that. But within the bounds of sort of scientifically sensible possibilities, then we should be building policies that are robust. And I think the only way to do that really is to make it open. Now, I don't necessarily mean every discussion that the government has needs to be, as it were, televised. I think that's also has real problems. And I think one of the problems with that, and actually one of the problems that the whole we'll be picking over when all the notes are gone through, and I know that there'll be an inquiry about how we did a bad job in dealing with this pandemic and how we could have done better, is that all the people involved in the decisions will feel very much in the firing line to be shot at, and that's pretty scary. And it's pretty scary at the time, because it tends to make one feel very, very liable not to venture forth with any unusual opinions, because you don't want to be the one person saying, well, why don't we try this, which turns out to be a disastrous idea. So I think there are downsides of making everything public, but I think some things should be public, and also there should be parallel processes going on in the public arena where people, qualified people are having these debates, and the government can look at those debates and ponder them. So we now have a sort of shadow sage. We can have several shadow sages. We can have shadow behavioural sages. I don't think we necessarily have to do this on a massive scale, but I think having the debate in the open is just bound to lead to better decision making.
I'm wondering if we would then almost see from the population, if you would see behavioral fatigue in just trying to keep up with all the endless debates going on, as we've seen with Brexit. I think everyone is sick and tired of Brexit, whether it's transparent or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time these things would not attract much interest or attention. I mean, at the moment, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but most of the time they'd be preparing for all kinds of possibilities which probably won't happen, and people would think, "Well, it's another one of these. Probably nothing's happening." But of course, the experts who are the most likely to be raising the alarm, they will be paying attention. They'll think, hang on, this is the thing I know about, and this is the thing I think is a real problem, and they'll shout. And so if there's a problem, we'll probably collectively have somebody drawing attention to it earlier. Now, of course, we do have to some extent that anyway, but we just need to make that a bit more. I mean, we have universities full of people who are looking around for worrying things to worry about, and quite right too. But I think the more connected that is to the government process, the better. The other thing I should say, actually, is that we need to have a plan for what to do in these kind of situations, and not be trying to make it up as we go along. Now, to some extent, I think the government did have pandemic planning in place, but possibly, and I don't know the details of this, but it may not have been planning for a virus with these characteristics. So I think we were quite well prepared for flu. So if it's the case, that just speculating, I don't know the details of what we were prepared for. But the danger is that if you're prepared for one thing, but only one or a small number of things, then if something else comes along, you think, well, this better be one of the things we prepared for, because we're not really sure what to do otherwise. So you shoehorn it in. So I think it's really quite important to have a diverse range of possible scenarios, and to think where the relevant issue in diversity is, we'll do something different. So I think it's a really, really good thing to be thinking, under what conditions would we have to lock the whole country down? Now, I suspect people didn't really think about that, because it seems so inconceivable, and in some ways that's understandable in retrospect. The idea that there'd be anything so extreme we'd lock the entire country down would have seemed like, well, how could that possibly be? We can't do that. Now, in fact, not only have we done it, the whole, the large portions of the world have done it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to think about those things. And I think this is, clearly pandemics are an extreme example. There are probably other threats where very surprising things could happen. So we need to be, there are clearly a variety of different possible sources of disaster, natural disasters of one kind or another, which could be very serious. And climate change, it's more probably slower burn, but more predictable. We're going to have big issues there. So, yeah, doing the planning as you're going along is crucial. I mean, this is something that I think in emergency services and in the military, they're very, very keen on. The idea that you just wing it is the last thing you want to be doing. I mean, if you're dealing with something where there's, it's really life critical, you do not want to think, well, we'll just sort this one out as we're going along. That is almost certainly going to be a disaster. So
winging it always to me sounds like a complete nightmare. I've never winged anything in my life. to think that maybe a government or a body of governance that ought to know better is just winging it with potentially, lives on the line is not really giving me the reassurance I need.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's a mixture. I mean, the governments around the world they'll have plans for some things, and they'll have very expert people with very good ideas. But the whole machinery of government is so complicated that, for example, you're trying to set up a contact tracing operation. Mm-hmm. That's something we ought to have thought a long time ago. Or indeed, ramping up testing. We had a long time to think about how to do that, even in this pandemic. We could have been planning that for months, but we seem not to have been. So we're scrambling to put it together very quickly. That makes it very difficult. So, for example, you should be asking questions a long time ago about how centralized do you think you want this thing to be? If you're doing contact testing and tracing, do you want to have the local regions doing that because they already have lots of expertise in doing that kind of thing on a small scale? Do you want to continue that even if some parts of the country get overwhelmed? One of the really strange things about the contact tracing process in Britain is we just stopped completely, even though lots of parts of the country we could have easily kept going because there weren't high levels of the virus. We just stopped. Now, admittedly, in London, say, that would have been impossible to continue to keep up, but lots of parts of the country it wasn't impossible. So some very strange decisions were made, which I think you wouldn't have made,
right,
except in the heat of the moment, if they were planned carefully beforehand and were scrutinizable, so that the whole sort of policy and academic community and think tanks and so on could look at these and think, well, is that actually sensible?
Yeah. I mean, in some cases, it feels like an impossible task because there are an infinite number of possibilities of things that the government should be prepared for. But I mean, I think you're right. I think, yes. if you go and ask experts who've dedicated their lives to a certain subject or topic, you're going to hear lots of opinions on crises that we could be facing in the next 10, 20 years at least. I mean, are there any models of governments that are doing something similar to this already?
That's a very good question, and I simply don't know the answer to that, actually. I bet some are doing much more than others, but it's a very interesting question, who's best prepared. I don't know. Probably it's very patchy. I suspect in reality, some governments are really good at preparing for one thing and probably totally missing something else. And again, this is where, international cooperation can be very helpful because we shouldn't be doing this in a vacuum, clearly.
You've actually mentioned this already, Nick, but you have had an interest in this pandemic specifically from a policy perspective. But obviously the pandemic was very, very sudden. And it is very difficult. I mean, we could have to some extent seen it coming. The signs were there, but, choices were made. Some signs were ignored. It is what it is. We know what we're currently up against. At least we seem to have quite a good idea, and policies are being directed as such. Now, in a very different matter, but from a policy perspective, also very, very important, we have climate change, which we have seen this coming. We've known about climate change for 2 decades, but policies are lagging, if I may say so. What is your view on climate change from a policy perspective? Do you think that we are treating this as the slow burning natural disaster that it is?
Well, I think climate change is incredibly hard from a policy point of view and from a political point of view, because it's this enormous, it's sort of a horrible mix of all the things you don't want. So one is that you can't, it's long term, so the effects are far in the future. It's also the science itself is actually not these days really disputed and hasn't really been disputed for a long time. But the sort of details are, no one's quite sure exactly how quickly things are going to start to happen and exactly what the modeling is not. It's not like being hit by an asteroid where you could say, well, the asteroid's flying through space. We can work out exactly when it's going to hit us, and we've got to get in there and intercept it. The science is inevitably much more uncertain because the climate's very complicated. And also, we have this huge problem of tragedy of the commons, that for every individual and nation, the benefit is shared between the benefit of me using less carbon is shared across everybody, but the benefit of using that carbon to drive me about, whatever, is just for me. So there's a danger that there's a sort of collective action problem that individual nations and companies and people are liable to think, well, I guess I will get on and do this as long as everyone else is, and perhaps slightly after them. So in fact, in that light, I think, I was very concerned, if we went back, say, 10 years, that I just couldn't really see a way we were going to get a global movement together to solve this problem at all. Now, I think I'm less negative about that now. I think a lot of things have happened. I mean, many of them are very much in progress, and there's lots of negative forces at work as well. But there is the Paris Agreement. Lots of countries now have really quite aggressive greenhouse gas targets. Now, having a target is one thing; hitting the target is another thing. And here, I think the UK has a mixed picture here. I mean, we've done very well in decarbonising our electricity grid. So our overall emissions on that front have come down quite a lot. On the other hand, almost all other areas are much harder to decarbonise, and we are not looking like we're going to hit our targets unless we take some fairly drastic steps in the next sort of few years, really. But on the other hand, there's legally binding targets which the government, I think, is taking very seriously. And not just this government, but any government will take very seriously. And I think I'm quite encouraged by the fact that across Europe and across large parts of the world, there really is in many places at least, a consensus that dramatic action is required. Now, having said that, that is not by any means ubiquitous. I mean, America obviously is falling out of the Paris Agreement, so that's a big problem. China is still building a lot of coal-fired power stations. That's another big problem. There are many others. But I'm not as despairing as I was. The other thing that I think is actually a stroke of incredible, not exactly good fortune, but it's something that needn't have worked out the way it has with the movement towards a more sustainable future, is that it's turning out that sustainable technology is just much cheaper than we expected. I mean, that's just a total miracle. I mean, the fact that solar and wind now are actually the cost competitive with any other, pretty much with any other fuel for generating electricity. And that will only improve, at least assuming that this is assuming current trends continue. So in fact, I'll have a quick interlude into a general principle. So one general principle we know, one of the few general principles we know in psychology is that is the power law of practice, which is that when you do something again and again and again, you get quicker, and in fact in a very regular way. So on log paper, there's a lovely straight line. Every time you do something every time you do something double the number of times, you get, say, 10% quicker or 20% quicker or whatever it is. If you double it again, you get 20% quicker again. So that pattern where you start off really slow and hopeless, and then you get quicker and quicker and quicker, but obviously the quickening itself is slowing down. That is ubiquitous for any human tasks, famously discovered for cigar rolling in Cuba, works for arithmetic, it works for reading, it works for anything at all. Now, the thing is, that also works, and is known to work in commercial contexts too. So you can look at something like the number of solar panels that have ever been built, or you can look at, for that matter, you can look at silicon chips, famous Moore's law is an example of this, or you can look at the number of wind turbines that have been built, and you can look at not so much speed here, though speed is actually lying at the bottom of this to some extent, just efficiency. So if you look at the question of how costly it is to produce electricity, for a given dollar, a dollar invested in wind turbines, then that used to be very expensive. You had to pay a lot of money to get your kilowatt hour of electricity if you're going to produce it through wind. But that's become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper in this very predictable way, the good old power law, just like the power law of practice. And now it's cost competitive with other fuels. But we know that the way the power law works, it looks like it's going to keep on going down. Now, you may hit some limit, that can happen. But looking at, say, Moore's law with computer chips, there hasn't been. The people have been saying that limit's coming any moment, but it hasn't been coming. It's still speeding up. It's going on very, very fast. And so this power law, I think, is very, very helpful because it tells us something about the future. We don't know precisely. And for example, batteries are another one. We don't know precisely whether there'll be some hard limit that means batteries can't get cheaper, but they've got a lot cheaper, and they're getting a lot cheaper still, and that really changes, for example, about in some contexts how useful renewables are. So I think the thing that we really didn't see coming is just how quickly certain kinds of cheap green technologies will actually be just the best thing to do, and I think that's very positive. And I think one of the things I'm very keen on is sort of thinking about the future we need to paint for ourselves and also at a global level, is to realize that a greener world is just going to be better. It's not that we have to sacrifice anything. I mean, we may in the short term, but actually once we're driving around in electric cars, in fact, hopefully electric public transport, and probably driving around a bit less because of all our excellent video technology, and we're powering everything by green electricity, we'll have obviously much better health because we'll have fewer horrible emissions, which are clearly very, very damaging. We'll be able to free up. We'll just generally be able to stop relying on resources which are depleting, which we can't reuse forever, and we'll be addressing the climate crisis. And I think that's just true in almost every area. There really aren't many technologies where switching to something more sustainable. This is true with the circular economy as well, recycling things rather than digging them up from scratch. And most of the time, once you do it, once you've got to the point of actually doing it seriously and efficiently, you're in a better place than you were before. So this makes me quite encouraged with respect to the tragedy of the commons problem, because the problem with that is that if it's the case that for any given company or nation or individual, it's actually better to do the sort of polluting thing, that's a problem. But I think that will be less and less true. And you see that with electric vehicles, which are not a panacea, and there's a lot of carbon embedded in electric vehicles and so on. And they're not costless from an environmental point of view, but they are a big step in the right direction. That the electric vehicles sounded once upon a time like we might just have to drive around in them, but it's going to be awful and everyone's going to hate it. But actually, the experience is everybody who has one thinks it's just brilliant. We love it. It's the best thing ever. And similarly, all of the side effects of the pollution and so on that they generate is reduced, not to zero, but it's reduced. So I think that gives me some cause for optimism, but it's just not clear how it's going to pan out. I mean, we've just got a big, partly because we don't know how quickly the nations of the world are going to actually pull towards really hitting their targets, and we don't know enough about climate science. I certainly don't, but nobody knows enough about the climate science to really know when we might pass some horrible threshold and find we can't. There's a sort of horrible positive feedback loop, and the planet starts to get hotter uncontrollably. So we don't know if that will be it. We think probably if we stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees, that's probably fairly safe, and that's probably right, but nobody knows for sure. But I don't think we should be despairing here. I think we can do it, but it's just it's going to require changing everything in a really fundamental way. But I think that's starting.
Yeah, I mean that's really positive. The idea we're moving towards a more incentive-compatible world, where actually what's best for the individual is to go for the greener option, which is, I mean, absolutely fantastic. I mean, I guess from a behavioural scientist point of view, we're always trying to think of what are the behavioural change challenges that we have to address or figure out what the solution is for. Are there any that stand out to you that where the incentives aren't quite aligning?
Well, they're not aligned. Well, yes. I mean, I think there are. I mean, I think some of the things are norms. So we're very used to travelling about furiously, and we need to do less of that. And so, for example, in the context of work, it's been a kind of norm that, although video conferencing technology has existed and worked reasonably well for a while, though it's getting better, that it sort of seems a bit, it's not paying someone due respect to have a business meeting or an academic meeting where you do everything remotely. It seems like just more appropriate, showing genuine commitment to actually get in the plane and fly across to see them. And I think that's a norm that might start to shift now. So similarly, another less critical one from a green point of view, but it's still interesting. Well, maybe more important, as important in the long term, is having everybody jammed into commuting from far and wide to the centres of big cities. So if it's the case that you think that every big company needs to have a grand headquarters and people need to go and work at the grand headquarters, and this needs to be as grand as possible because it's showing what a strong company this is, then you will have Canary Wharf full of big offices. And people will then spend a lot of carbon and actually human misery as well, just struggling to get to them every day. But you can imagine an alternative world in which there'll clearly be some headquarters and there'll be some in-person meetings. Of course there will, but it will be viewed as the normal, natural thing to do things virtually, and it might even be the sort of cool, agile thing to do. It might be, you wouldn't want to be one of those companies which sends people physically all over the world all the time. I mean, it's so inefficient and so bad for the planet, and why would it is sort of dinosaur-like behavior?
Yes, just archaic. You should be embarrassed. It's the 21st century. Get with it.
Yeah, come on, yeah. But I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's that sort of perspective that, come on, yes, this is a different world now. I mean, but just before the pandemic, I was thinking about whether we ought to be whether we ought to be trying to switch to video seminars, not necessarily entirely, but for visiting speakers for meetings. And I was inspired to think about this, and I've wondered about it for a while because so many people have. But I was particularly interested because somebody I know, Alex Pouget at Geneva, had just started doing what they were calling green seminars. So they had people from all over the world, but they didn't involve any carbon. And they had they had the talk, and then you meet the different people you'd normally speak to, just on a one-to-one level, and all of that stuff would just be done. So it would be just as close as possible to the normal experience, but you'd not burn any carbon. And that seems like, as soon as you think, oh, well, that's actually a cool way to do it, that's the way you'd want to do it. If you happen to be, touring around sort of near Switzerland anyway, then you could take a train over to Geneva. That's fine. But the idea that you would start in, say, California and then go to Switzerland, then come back again 2 days later, I mean, that's like completely crazy. So I think, establishing these new norms, I think that's very important. I mean, we see how powerful that can be with something like the plastic bag tax, which is actually an amazing success. Because I think that as we all know, the point of that tax isn't that the crushing burden of that 5 pence or whatever it is pushing me away from getting a bag. It's that it's a little reminder saying you shouldn't do this, should you? You shouldn't, and I do. I mean, the point is we buy into this. It wouldn't work if we thought, the nanny state trying to tell me not to have plastic bags. Sure. I will have my plastic bag, because we all think, no, we don't want plastic bags. They're a bad idea. We know it really. And I think if those sort of deep-seated behavioural and attitudinal shifts about what is normal behaviour, that's a big deal. I mean, similarly, leisure travel as well. I mean, we clearly have to, as a population, we have to spend less time hurtling around the world randomly, just for fun. I mean, it doesn't mean we can do no leisure travel. I suspect that's not the case. But it can't continue to grow. Certainly not at a substantial rate. And decarbonising air travel is pretty difficult. It's not impossible, and there may be ways of doing it, but it's unusually tricky. Sure. So we don't want to have a rapidly expanding. We may have some expansion, but we don't want a rapidly expanding, crazily expanding amount of air travel.
When it actually comes to, as you mentioned, social norms leading to not so desired behavior or behavior that just isn't great for the planet, and then there being a massive disruption in which we are questioning the social norms, in which we are actually challenging them, and in which we might actually reject them. Is there I almost dare and say it, a silver lining to this pandemic? We've gone completely on lockdown. Well, India has stated it hasn't had this level of clean air, I think, in decades. So there are things that indicate that there are good things coming out of this pandemic. I mean, despite it being a pandemic. Yeah.
No, I think that is true. I mean, I think clearly the pandemic overall is a terrible thing, which will do much more harm than good. But it'd be crazy not to take the good things. We would clearly have to. If there are good things that there are, we should absolutely be taking them and grabbing onto them. I think that's totally right. And the possibilities of changing some of our social norms to do things like we're doing now, rather than do things in person where we can, changing the patterns of work, I think, and travel. That's really quite a big deal. And I think one of the things, exactly as you mentioned, the fact that it's leading to discernibly clearer air, that's a powerful thing, because you don't want to go back willingly to going, once you've had clean air, to going back to pollution. Now, clearly, we can't stay at this level for very long, and we're starting to come out of it. But I do hope there are some really serious changes that we can actually grab hold of. And so to some extent, we may be able to have accelerated changes that probably would have happened anyway, but might have taken 5 or 10 years. We might have managed to push things forward quickly.
What do you think the best way is to hold on to the positive changes that have come out of this? Because we're gonna come out of lockdown. Whether this is gonna lead to a second wave, yes or no, we won't know until we try. Unfortunately,
probably yes.
Yeah, probably yes. It is likely with how people are currently behaving. But what is the best way to move forward, not neglecting the small silver linings that we have seen?
Well, I think I mean, I think in general, I think we do need to move slowly. So I think just in terms of the pandemic itself, we clearly should be moving slowly. So even as we start to get back to normal, I think all of us as individuals should be taking a very cautious approach. And it's difficult to do. And there is a collective action problem here too, because the people, for many people, the danger of the likelihood of getting a virus is in a way that is actually going to be have serious health consequences quite low. If you're young enough, then you're probably you're both in that category. Although actually, it can be pretty horrendous.
Yeah.
So it's no picnic getting this virus. I think for many people, even if they're young and healthy. But of course, there's a problem that for the people who will suffer physically are the people who aren't those people will be their parents and grandparents and so on. So we have a collective action problem coming out of this, and I think the more cautiously and gingerly we can do it, the better, and with the close monitoring as possible. And I think we should. I think as a country, and indeed as a world, we do need to be having lots of debates about what we want to keep. And I really think the slower we come out, the easier it'll be to keep things too, because we're just ingraining new habits and new norms. And things like working remotely seems like that's very hard. I feel like that's got real momentum behind it. It just makes so many things so much easier. Now it does also have really big implications for the business model of lots of organizations. So I hate to say it, including universities, that to the extent that we can, I'm not thinking about any particular university, but just the university sector as a whole, to the extent that it's able to do things online pretty well, then that also implies, well, actually, you could be doing this online for more people, more cheaply, and that would actually be well worth thinking about, because the access to higher education across the globe is not of a high quality, is a massively important resource of huge importance in terms of equality, both within countries and across countries. And the cost of education is too high. There's no question about it. The cost of higher education is way, way higher than it needs to be. And we have the technology to do it much more cheaply, and we need to do it much more cheaply. So thinking about making the world better, we should be thinking about, well, the way we're now starting to do things, is there a way of doing this? It doesn't have to be the only thing we do, but can we make this more standard? I mean, this is something that's been coming for a long time, but I think there are going to be big disruptions in lots of sectors where we can start to think about doing things differently. But of course, that is disruptive, because once you start to do things differently, then to some extent, some of the old ways, people might think, wow, is it really worth paying all that money just so we can be seen in person and meet up friends? The answer may be yes, maybe it is true, but it's not. There will be ramifications. But I think we just have to go with the flow on that. When we've got to make these big changes. And in terms of things, anything to do with information and education, I think the more open and global we can make things, the better. And so if I want to learn to program a computer, why don't I take the 101 course in MIT or Caltech or Cambridge, wherever I am on the globe? Why not? I mean, it's just that course should be available, and some of them are for free. But then, of course, at the moment, I can't get examined in that course and get a appropriate certificate. So I have to actually go to one of those very expensive and very high prestige places, which are very hard to get into, to get my, as it were, my piece of paper. And that, I think, we might see some changes there. I hope we do.
Yeah. Fantastic. I mean, thank you so much, Nick, for taking the time to speak with us. It's been incredibly illuminating. And the final thing that we like to ask our guests, we've talked about a lot this episode, but what would be your take-home message for the listener? Trying to wrap everything up into a nice, neat bow. What's one thing you want the listener to take away with them if they take one thing away from this episode?
Well, I think if you take one thing away, I think it would be that it's a slightly dispiriting thing that behavioural scientists don't have the answers. Right? So don't look to behavioural scientists to say, how should we handle this pandemic, or how should we handle the problem of climate change? Behavioural scientists, I think, have some methods, some experimental methods, and they have some insights which are useful. But to actually get real answers, you need to put lots of people with lots of disciplines together. Even then, you won't be sure of anything. And if you're thinking about something behavioural, you've just got to test things out. You just don't know what's going to work. My endless experience with experiments, I'm sure everybody is in the same position. You can have the greatest conviction, even in a lab setting, your experiment is going to work. Quite often it doesn't. So in the context of predicting what's going to happen in the real world, try things out. That's the big lesson of behavioural science, I think.
Absolutely fantastic. And finally, if you would like to plug yourself or your social media or anything that you're doing at the moment, take this moment.
Yes, indeed, Bob. So I would like to plug my book, the Penguin book, The Mind is Flat, published a couple of years ago. So that is available on Kindle and in all good bookstores, and I'm sure in lots of other forms, and indeed in audio book, excitingly. And what else? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that's. I mean, lots of exciting collaborations with lots of wonderful people, and I do recommend the amazing group at Warwick. I mean, it is astounding. I think it's, although obviously we're all biased in its favour. It is an astonishing place to do behavioural science, and any good behavioural science that comes out of it is hugely improved by the amazing environment. It's really quite a remarkable place. So everybody out there should check out Warwick's astonishing group of great people.
All right. I think that's the nicest plug I've heard so far. And with that, we end the interview. Like Sarah already said, Nick, thank you so much for making the time. It was a great talk.
You're very welcome.
So yeah, that was us talking to the amazing Nick Chater, who very nicely plugged the Warwick Business School, or the Warwick Behavioural Science Research Group, of which obviously I'm a part of that. I feel very good about that plug, if I may say so.
Yes.
Not to ignore Nottingham, Nottingham University, where Sarah's based, also very, very good research group. We're not picking sides.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was a really, really good conversation. I think I learned a lot. I think it's I mean, I remember, when I signed my name under that open letter, I remember Sarah signing her name under that open letter. And I think we've actually touched upon a point where a lot of people don't really understand behavioral science, and they think it's a quick fix or a band-aid. And if you can claim that, something, comes from behavioral science, and apparently that means that we know everything about people, everything about behavior in every conceivable context, which, as the UK government has shown us, no.
I mean, it's interesting, the development and the phases of behavioral science and its presence in academia and outside of academia. I think we've seen the shift from sort of behavioral science being rejected in the academic community, from it being accepted within the academic community, the genesis of behavioral science in business and in policy, and people becoming engaged with behavioral science through sort of pop behavioral science books. And I think now we're reaching a point where behavioral science is shifting again. And I think it's shifting from, as you said, and as Nick really nicely put it, shifting from this core assumption that behavioral science holds the answers to the universe, right? Your businesses are not running correctly, your government's not running correctly because we're all governed by behavioral biases and heuristics, and everyone's making systematic errors, and here's behavioral science with this lens that can point to that behavior and say, hey, look, we've got some insights, and if you just do this and switch the default and change this framing device, you've solved it. And I think the next phase of this is sort of more behavioral science skepticism, which I think is necessary for us to move forward and actually to be implementing behavioral science responsibly and accurately. But it will be interesting to see who is going to be pushing against this next phase of behavioral science and who is going to be leading the charge. Because I do think that there is an element of behavioral science is now a very nice marketing tool. It's something that I think people hold up to separate themselves from other consulting agencies or other types of practitioners. And if that's the only thing that you've got going for you, and then suddenly we're turning around and saying, actually, behavioral science is just a bunch of methods that work sometimes. But can't give us the whole answer, that sort of diminishes this value that you've created for yourself within the market. So interesting to see how that one plays out. But
no, absolutely. I think it's a really, really good point. I think talking to Nick when we talked about this specifically, but also when we talked about policy more in general, it reminded me about the talks that we've already recorded, both with Ghana, which was absolutely great talk, which that one's already released, and the talk that we've had with both Tim and Kurt from Behavioural Grooves, because I remember Kurt suddenly going off on a very eloquent summary of where he thinks behavioural science is going. And he did mention that to some extent, we have had, through being affiliated with psychology, that we've had a replication crisis. But within his point of view, that wasn't necessarily a crisis, not in the true sense of the word. And I think if we look into behavioral science in academia, but also behavioral science as it's being practiced so within industry, I don't think the replication crisis was that bad. I think it opened up, it made more transparent some shady practices going on, predominantly in academia. The ivory tower is quaking. P hacking, sample falsification, data falsification, all that type of stuff, to indicate that even if these effects seem very intuitive and seem very robust, that doesn't mean that we got there with the right method, and that if we do get there with the right method, they might actually no longer hold up. And I think if you want to be a science, albeit a social science, that wants to be taken seriously, you need to be able to figure out what is flower and what is weed. And I think it is time that we start applying some serious weed killer, because otherwise we're not going to survive the marketing hype that we're currently seeing in industry. Yeah. But this is something to be really concerned about, right? Like, we're now applying insights that we know a bit about to industry, where the damage is profit or no profit. But if we're applying it to policy, where the damage can be, the exploitation of one population over other, or in this case, within the pandemic, generally the livelihood of people, but maybe more importantly, their lives.
Right.
We can't come up with half-baked, hacked insights. I think we are beyond that. As a field, we're young, but we're too old for this type of teenage bullshit. We're no longer teenagers. Yeah. It's time to take ourselves seriously enough to build a proper field on proper methods with proper insights and proper testing, and kill everything else off. As terrible as it sounds, like physics didn't get to be physics because it gave platform to every charlatan that ever showed up.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. But even if we move towards this behavioral science utopia where everything is extremely robust and communicated in a nuanced fashion, right, rather than producing generalizations, that only serves to solve half the problem. I think the other part of the problem is if you only have a behavioral scientist in the room, then you're only going to be getting a very small part of the story. We need to be having experts from all different backgrounds, all different perspectives, all different types of trainings. And I think I share Nick's sentiment of sort of, what should policy making look like? He pitched it, and he did an amazing job of articulating what this transparent process might look like. But I think just that underpinning idea of having experts from all different backgrounds, from all different disciplines, inside, outside of academia, different perspectives, demographics, all debating policies in this sort of transparent fashion. You're going to get so much from just having that conversation and inviting people into the room that disagree with you. I mean, this links back to, I think, the conversation we had with Paul Dolan, a little bit of actually trying to engage with people who aren't just going to agree with you or share your point of view. Actually having that skepticism and that challenge, and okay, maybe the world could be something else than what I think or believe it to be.
No, absolutely. I think a lot of interesting things were mentioned by Nick that we've also seen in talks with other people. Like you said, Paul Dolan, again, that talk is also not out yet, but forthcoming. But no, there's a lot of arguments to be made for what can propel behavioral science forward in general, and then behavioral science and policy. Paul called it adversarial collaboration. I think that's a good starting point for figuring out, this is how I perceive the world. This is the knowledge that I have being a behavioral scientist, and this is how I see it. But if then, with regards to this pandemic, maybe more specifically, you have someone who's actually a virologist, someone who knows the very core mechanisms within, the pandemic, the disease itself that is happening, they might tell you that what you're suggesting is, from a physiological perspective, nonsense. and that your suggestion is going to make things worse because they perceive the world very differently than you do, given their background, given their expertise. And they will challenge you. And I do think behavioral science has not been challenged enough as it stands. It got challenged a lot. It got discarded well, in this case, I suppose behavioral economics got discarded quite a bit. Because economics as a field is not very open, and economics as a field knows that.
We do.
At least it's not delusional enough to think that it's an open field, because it's not. But then it got
some of us do. Some of us know that. Not all of us.
Okay, but not the majority. And then, behavioral economics got accepted, and then it got popularized, and then it got Nobel Prizes. But just because, you've got a prize doesn't mean you're the be it end all. And I'm a bit concerned. I think the Nobel Prize winners don't deserve their prize? That's not what I'm arguing. I do think they've done great work, but I think there's much more work that still needs to be done before we suddenly only send a team of behavioral scientists to governments all over the globe, just randomly making up some policies. I think we should be on the panel, but I don't think we should be the panel.
No, I think you're right. And I think as we've discussed, part of the problem is just not knowing where these ideas came from. Right? Obviously, it was latched onto. There may have been agendas as to why it was convenient, maybe, for the government to use this insight, this behavioral-based insight, to sort of back up something that they probably already wanted to do, but not knowing who suggested it or in what capacity or what evidence they referred to doesn't allow us to debate it. So I think that's, part of why Nick's open letter that he wrote alongside some colleagues was so refreshing. And I think, I don't know about you, but there was a big response, at least within my circle of academic friends who were just rallied behind it. It was a bit of a rallying cry. So
no, absolutely. Yeah. Keep in mind, Nick represents Warwick, so I'm pretty sure he had all of Warwick behind him. We're like, yes, we'll follow Nick Schrader, into battle we go. It was massively popularized amongst us as well, and I don't think there's really anyone from Warwick within the behavioral science group that has received the call to action that didn't pay it any attention. At least I can't really imagine, if I'm being honest. So this is good stuff. Adversarial, but good.
Exactly. And I think that's where we want to be. And on that note, I think that's where we're going to end the episode today. So thank you all for listening. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you learned something. And let's continue the conversation online. If you have a perspective that is different to ours, we'd love to hear it. And we'd love to talk to you more and talk more about this topic, which I'm sure we will in future episodes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we would talk about this next week or the week after. It's a good topic. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening, and we hope you have a good week.
That don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love. You're the one I wanna give to.